I wanted to do a bit of a slightly different talk. I know a lot of the workshop are about letting people go through what is a bit of code, explaining the decisions, the ideas, and the benefits. And I think that's very a useful kind of workshop. I did a couple of those in the past, PyData London mostly. But I think there's been a question on everybody's mind lately. And even if it feels like it's a very new question, it's a question I've heard before. And I wanted to use this opportunity to have what I think is actually a workshop where I expect a bit more interaction than when you just throw a lot of code at people around what does it mean to work in data. There's many talks about what is it that recruiters are looking for. There's a lot of talk about how to think about the career with like mostly based on people's examples. But I was hoping to do something a little different that maybe is a bit more theoretical and that looks at the current trend, especially around the use of large language models and intelligent agents, whatever we expect to see coming out of that big barely year-old revolution now. And see if that is going to change the way we do our work, if it's going to be the same kind of change that we've seen in the recent past. The honest way to look at what I wanted to make was I don't know. A lot of times people talk from a point of view of experience, from a point of view of confidence. I don't know what's going to happen for the data jobs, however you want to define them, in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I've been doing that job for almost 25 years now, so I've seen 2, 3, 4, 5 revolutions, depending on where you want to set the bar. And they've all followed the same kind of logic that is hard to recognize from the get-go. But I think the gentleman that you see the photo now on your screen, Ronald Coase, is someone who offered a really good framework to think about it. And I would love to explore with you, and hopefully that's going to be interactive, what does the way he looks at organization can help us think, what is the role of a data and what will be the impact of having what looks like semi-intelligent language models? What would that mean in the what would that mean for us in the medium term? And would that change a lot of how we think about our job? It's very much an attempt for me to force myself to speak out loud the kind of ideas I've had and to see if they make sense to peers. So I'm very much hoping to have some sort of feedback. There's a QR code on your screen, so if you want to participate, you can scan the QR code on your phone. You're going to be on a dedicated version of this presentation. Or otherwise, you can go on menti.com and type the 8-digit code, so that's 1768-0757. That should put you in like a version of this note. And whenever I've got questions for you, hopefully that you can participate. I'll leave that on screen for an extra second. This tool is mostly meant for like quizzes. So I'd recommend you use it if you have like pub quiz or like if you want to do something a bit fun with friends. It's also really helpful if you want to have feedback. It's a tool that was developed by a company called Mentimeter in Sweden, where most meetings are very social, like everybody participates quite actively. Everybody has to speak quite actively. That tool allows them to have the same kind of contribution and participation, even if you're in a large group. And I think it's a really helpful tool to go from tiny head in the screen talks at you, or for my version, I'm just speaking on my computer like I'm a little deranged. Hopefully that tool can allow us to have a bit more interactions. I think Zoom is a really good tool for that, but having a bit more structure around it is going to be really, really helpful. One of the first questions I would ask when we see that kind of question is, what would be the kind of advice that you've heard? What would be the kind of things that advice you would give? What would be the kind of precautions that you would make nowadays? I'd love to get a bit more of your impression of what you expected from this talk and a lot more understanding of what is your understanding of the current, how to think about your career, how to think about the job market, how to think about the work itself. I'm not seeing a ton of response. So I might just move on. Hopefully, this code should be active for a little bit longer if I understand properly how it works. So hopefully, if you see this as a recorded version, you can still scan the code and go back to answer. I'd be very interested in seeing what your answers are. One thing that I just want to clarify before going forward is what this talk is not meant. It's not a tactical talk about how to win during interviews. There's very good tricks on how to do that. I'm more than happy to go through that step by step, especially if we, tomorrow I'm spending a bit of time at mentoring session, so more than happy to go through it. I think not everybody needs the same kind of feedback. One key thing, for instance, is how much you speak, and it's very difficult to tell people you should speak less or you should speak more because it really depends on how much you speak already. It's also like not something I'm very good at. I've never considered myself being particularly great at interviews. I get stressed quite easily, and that's not helpful. It's also not a talk about how to have some sort of hack to get your career to be at a better paying position, typically how to be a manager. There's definitely elements that help to think about how that role is different from this role, so that can help structure that thinking. But it's not just a talk about here's what senior means, even though there's something I'm going to uncover. And more importantly, this is not a talk where I have clear answers. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm scared, if I'm being honest. I'm guessing you hear that in my voice. I wish I had clear answers. I wish I had the ability to say, here's what's going to happen in 2-3 years and say what you need to do if you don't want to be left behind. But I'm not sure. A lot of people are scared because of LLM, because of very abstract concepts of violent accelerations or things like that. I do not believe those changes. I don't think this is realistic, at least not in the short term. It just sounds confusing to me at best. But I've seen a lot of technological transformation in the industry. 2001, before that, with the computer bubble, the tech bubble, there was people that misunderstood what was happening, that took trends and just extended them further than they were supposed to, which is a very common problem. So I think this is what's happening with the AI accelerationist position, is just they take a trend and they're just assuming it's going to explode because it looks exponential for now. I remember seeing that around 2007, 2008, when the word data scientist appeared. It was a big relief for me because I was finally able to explain what I was doing. I had been doing that job for like almost 10 years at this point without like a clear word for it, which was a bit frustrating. There was a big change in how much we were able to do around the big data trend, around having cheap mobiles for ads. And so the job we have has changed, but it has always changed in two directions. It became more valuable and it became bigger, more impactful, more data, better tools. It became better in that way. There's been some tremendous effort around tooling more recently since 2017-18 with DBT for the reporting side, and the whole, we need to think about data analytics, the analytics as an engineering profession, as a thing, which I think is really helpful. There's been tremendous progress around MLOps in the same period, that like there's dozens of tools around that. All those have made the job smarter, better, more structured, more helpful. More recently, there's been some rub with everybody working remotely in 2020 and people coming back. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing because I think it should have helped a lot of the data jobs, but things didn't go as smoothly as I would have hoped then. A lot of people lost their job, but more importantly, most companies were not able to understand. We could look at how the data team think about information and use that to improve our own internal process. There was a missed opportunity there that for me felt worrisome. And more generally, I'm seeing tools that are coming out now that are incredibly good at doing the work that I would consider be a core part of what we're doing. But I'm not necessarily, it's not super obvious for me what is left for humans to do. A very common metaphor for a lot of the progress we've seen is you can automate away the boring, mechanical, physical part of your job. You don't have to run somewhere or take a horse. You can use a bicycle or a car. You don't have to compute by hand. You don't have calculators. And that left people with high-level functions. I'm not sure this is going to be true. And that's why this I want to talk about is I want to explain what are the basis for the reasoning, because I think they're relevant in the next case. They illustrate what we're trying to do a bit better, but I don't know if this is going to be as effective as I don't know. I would love to get your take on where do you think is left? How does that model explain what you're going for? I'm going to cover essentially 4 topics. One is where this talk is from. I've breached on that a bit really, but just a bit of my experience and detail of like different revolution I've seen. I'm going to talk about how the data field has had an increasing amount of keywords, an increasing amount of abstractions, of concepts, of patterns, and this is the key of the revolutions until now. I think a key thing to understand how LLM work is this concept of pattern. Third, I'm going to just go briefly through the kind of economic modeling that I think is relevant for what we try to do. And finally, hopefully with a shape of a conclusion, but maybe less conclusive than that, a bit of what does that mean for our careers, if I'm being honest, not just yours, and it makes sense. The last decades for data tools, COP 2.5 for me, but maybe more or less for you, have had a very common pattern. I've talked about the net bubble, I've talked about the invention of the word data scientist, or the idea of big data and the bigger promises of the more recent models. I remember this is a photo from an event that was before PyData was a big thing. There was something called big data. This one was the event in Paris. And there was a lot of very promising presentation of people who were winning Kaggle competition and showed the kind of framework they applied. And they were like, we can just use that. And basically, you don't have to do your work of selecting features, doing features, all that can be automated. And the question I wanted to ask at the end of every one of those presentations was, does this mean we all out of a job? The first time it was a bit of a mockery, then it became a bit more serious because it all got better. There was a point, because I was a monthly meeting and I pretty much asked that question every time. After a year and a half, 2 years, that just became an internal joke. And people knew they're going to have to ask that question. They were going to answer that question. Every time the answer was, well, yes, I've kind of oversold the product because, of course, I know everybody's going to lose a job. But it allowed people to think, here's what's left. Here's what my tool is now asking you to do. And I think forcing people in that reasoning really help think the tools don't replace you, they raise you one level. But I don't know if this is what's left. The document that illustrated a lot of what we had when I talked about the job, typically there was an ambiguity. A lot of tools helped with the yellow box, and the job became all the other boxes. And that's what does the job mean? That contradiction was, I think, really insightful. That graph with different versions, because there's versions with different tasks and different boxes, makes a lot of sense. One thing that I think came out of this discussion was the organizer for that event is Florian Douetou, that you probably know as the CEO of DataIQ, which was one of the very first framework, who was able to see that AI was not just Kaggle tricks to take a given data set and turn it into a good model. There was all these other boxes around, and DataIQ was trying to take over and make those boxes a little bit more manageable, a little bit better, rather than just offer like a really great tricks and tips and patterns for the orange one. One thing I would love to ask, there's not a ton of audience participation, so I don't know if I should expect much, but if you see anything missing in that graph, for me, there's definitely one, which is around, are we training for the right kind of model? Are we aligned? Is that model actually going to be helpful for once we have this decision, this inference, is that something we can use to make better sense? Because if I can tell you what you're going to buy, that means I can have high click-through for ads, but I'm not going to raise your profile. I need to figure out what you wouldn't buy unless we showed it to you. So it's a slightly different question. I think those twists are kind of important in the question. But you can ask that questions once you've fixed a lot of those boxes. And that has led overall in the industry to increased specialization. I'm going to go into a bit more detail afterward, but we went for like a single loosely defined job of data scientist to more than 10 distinct roles that just do not have the same candidates. To a point now then, like people ask, am I a data engineer, or am I a machine learning engineer, or am I an MLOps? And if I can talk to you, I'd be reasonably obvious what you should take, what is the thing that actually interests you, but these are not the same careers. That increased specialization, I think, is really good because it helps people be more effective, focus on things they care about. But I don't know if that's going to continue. There's a forest of tools I don't want to put on screen because it's just going to take over the entire space, but like of all the different vendors, all the different partners, all the different frameworks. And we went from 2 or 3 good ideas to 15 good ideas to hundreds of vendors. And at this point, it's impossible to describe what is a good data stack. But you can still somehow make sense of it because a lot of them share patterns, share ideas, share concepts. It's bricks that are put together to making sense. And I think that modularity is something that has been incredibly helpful. And that has helped people navigate this diversity. And that's helped people understand data functions as clearer. Because they're clearer, because they make more sense, there's an increased amount. And this increased precision has been incredibly positive for the salaries, the number of people involved, and the impact we can have. Now, everything is improved by data materially, every interaction you can imagine, and that is, I think, really, really positive. But I don't know if that's going to continue. I don't know if LLMs are going to change. Another slide where I mentioned your participation. I'd love if you want to do the Q&A should be open, I believe. No question from the audience. But if you want to ask a question here on Slack, on Zoom, I'm more than happy to answer. But I'd love to I can talk about my diagnostic experience and how the question I kept asking at the end of one specific conference was helpful, but I'd love to get your take. My thinking isn't clear, and that's something I want to make sure. And I think the point of this workshop would be for us to think how to apply the frameworks that I'm going to talk about a bit later. So I see a question, Jifari. If you go on Mentimeter, menti.com, and use the code 17680757, you should be able to follow along. The information is here at the top of the screen. First thing, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's the idea that data has increasingly had more keywords. There's roughly 3 families of data roles at the moment. The historical one, the one that I was explaining for, is just the role of analyst that was doing reporting. Here's what's happening. The word statistician presumably came from someone in the 17th century who wanted to know how the state was doing, hence the name. That is a very old approach, but it has specialized. It hasn't changed that much compared to the other two. The second one is what has been called data scientists later, which is to make inferences. It's not just here's what's happening, here's what we can guess happens, here's what people you probably want to recommend, here's things that could have happened otherwise. It's counterfactuals, it's that abstraction. That has been a big focus of the job for a while, and a lot of what PyData is talking about is tools that help do that second part a bit better. The reporting is key part of it, but you can materially different. The part that is quite new, and I don't know how much of PyData is dedicated to that part, but that's the part that's been quite revolutionary in the last year, is the effort of generative tools. This was formerly creative people. This was, until now, it was people that had nothing to do with data, and there's kind of a takeover there that is kind of original and new, but all 3 of those branches have evolved with very different roles, with very different constraints. The role of an analyst is typically to make dashboards, to make curves, to show people something that they're not able to see otherwise, either production or for operational analyst. The second role, historically, that is very common and we think very key, is the role of an A/B testing statistician, someone who's able to understand t-tests and what are the constraints around it. This one is actually kind of rare. We'll see a bit later why, but this has been the 2 historical counterpart of the role. The one role that has emerged in 15 years ago, that is now very well set, is someone who's building data pipeline, who takes data from one place to another. There's a whole abstractions around the concept of ETL, and the formalism around it that has evolved, and that made this job reasonably well defined quite early. It's not someone who says anything or does anything interesting, it's someone who shapes the data in the right way. And between this role and the other 2, there's been a layer between that has evolved thanks to certain type of tooling, which is now they have the right kind of data, you need to change its shape. And that is present in the ETL acronym. It's the T part of the, or the ELT part of the process. And so you can extract and load data engineer, and then you can transform it with an analytics engineer. That is mostly because the idea of having a separate object of a data model, that is, I'm not trying to answer questions, but I'm making you answering those questions something that is more intuitive because the data is structured properly. A key pattern in that reporting family of data tools. The inference role is the role that most of you are more familiar with. A lot of statistical work. The name data scientist was relevant, but it has split into machine learning researcher, which is people who try to be a bit more creative and innovative and publish paper around it, or machine learning engineer, someone who tried to apply it. But that wasn't enough. Because you were able to write code that was stable, you still had to host it. You had to make sure that the service you had was something that other teams could rely on. hence the need to rely on DevOps and a specialized version of DevOps, machine learning operations. And so we now have one job that has split into at least 4 different jobs, but it kind of makes sense. And that's just not it. One of the more common inferences that now people are making, because there's, I would say, an overflow of statistician, that because devs still have a bit more free time, is to think of less obvious inferences, things like causal inference models. That is a non-trivial piece of work and something that generally requires some level of experience we get, for instance, for a PhD in economics or something similar. And that is an evolution that came from this increased stability of this increased availability, because the tools are getting better and you can automate and you don't have to worry so much about how well a model not really have a solution. The job that is new, and that is, because it's new, doesn't come with all the baggage of the other previous one, is a job of around generative AI. The big obvious is deep learning researcher, but that is a job that is rare because the resource needs are now within billions of dollars. So you don't have that many companies that are able to have that kind of just the framework and the resource around it. But it is it's probably the most exposed job. The one that is appearing that is not well defined is around security or ethics researcher. It's still very much a data job. It's still asking people to understand the dimensions, the finality of what is a data object, but it inherits from philosophy, it inherits from safety in a way that is quite new. And I think the role that most of us are more familiar with, that makes the most sense, the one that you've seen the most talk at conference like PyData, is people talk about prompt engineering. I wasn't very convinced this was a real job, but one thing that is absolutely a real job is someone who does all the glue on top of the prompt engineering. It's someone who implements a custom version of a RAG, someone who implements a custom version of chain of thought that integrates that into front end that is internal to the company, that is able to connect. The closest I can think is people that until recently were just messing around Zapier. These are not necessarily always technical people, but a lot of people that have been hacking around the PySphere have very keen around that kind of effort. Question I would love to ask for participants, if this is something that makes sense, is, have I missed anything? Do you feel like there's more than the 10 roles I've described just now that have appeared in the last 10 years around the data sphere? The reason I want to just explore that diversity is I want to later argue that for each of those roles, you want to further break down into individual tasks, and you want to figure out which one of those tasks is something that an LLM can take over entirely, which one of those tasks is something that can be automated by a pattern, which one of those tasks is something that is going to lead to more tools that lead to more specialization. You have this process of, I had a model, and I, because hosting that model and training that model was like different job, we have a specialized business analyst. Definitely, I would think of business analyst as someone who's either an operations analyst or product analyst, because I see a difference between those two, but that is, I would say, the first job I mentioned. AI sustainability researcher. I haven't heard of sustainability other than the context of how much energy data centers take. Even if the AI data centers are a lot larger, I don't know if there's a specialty there. But yeah, I think that makes sense to, there's a friend who's trying to make sure that data centers only run when the electricity they're running on is renewable. It feels like it's an operational data scientist more than anything else, but there might be some specialty there that I'm missing. But yeah, those I think are really good examples of roles that we want to see what is that person doing on a day-to-day basis, what are the tasks, and are those tasks things that we can automate either via a framework or a data pattern. The key concept when you try to look at what is our job, the key concept that you keep again and again is the idea of data pattern. It's a way to organize data that makes a lot of sense. You have the first, second, third, fourth, and now I think fifth and sixth normal form of how to organize a table. You have the idea of a session, the idea of a funnel, the idea of a subscription flow. There's a lot of those data patterns that essentially are very standardized way of looking at things. There are also data patterns that they cannot be standardized, even if the idea itself is easy to share. One common thing is if you look at churn, you want to understand what people churn, and so you want to look at what's the last action before someone churn. This makes a lot of sense, but it has to be tailored. The reason I make this distinction is between standard and tailored. I think standard is going to go into tools, and it's going to be easy to reproduce, and it's going to be something that no one does. Because, well, if you have like a list of data, it's easy to imagine a software that's given data with like a reasonable shape of list of events, is able to infer what is a funnel. It wouldn't be someone's job, or it would be the person who looks at that is someone who's not a data person, because that can be reasonably well automated. While there are tasks where even if the pattern itself makes sense, like causal analysis, you still need someone to do a lot of a task that's only a data scientist, or in this case, a statistician, in this case, of last session, like a product analyst, to tailor the tools properly. And so for me, the reason is that a job I'm going to lose? Yes. There's ways, if my job is to do code review, or part of my job is to do code review, I expect LLM to be able to do code review in a way that is meaningful enough that it won't be a meaningful part of my job. Maybe I'm missing, I don't know. If, for instance, someone's job is to do ML hosting, because that's a very common pattern too, I would expect most people to now be familiar enough with cloud providers to be like, this is a standard way of doing things, and we're not going to have meaningful improvements if we don't host them ourselves, unless we're in a very specific, unusual use case, like we have to host on premise or something like that. The benefit of those patterns is that not just they take over your job, but also they allow you to make the job a lot more flexible. I talked about hundreds of vendors. It makes sense because you have those patterns, because you might not know exactly what Amazon Athena does. You have names like, but you're not sure it's the right one. It's a sensible question to ask, what is Google's version of Athena? That is like, if you ask that to most experienced data scientists, like, oh yeah, I know what that means, because they have a concept of machine learning hosting system, and they have a concept of the feature of Athena, and they won't just say, oh, this is it. So they say that one exists, but like those features and that features actually are in a separate tool, because the breakdown of tools is a little bit different. And data patterns is not just within, there's like code patterns that are famous, but beyond just code patterns, there's work patterns. The idea of version control. People think of it as connected to code. It doesn't have to be. Lawyers would love to use version control, for instance. If you write Dungeons and Dragons, having a version control that would make a ton of sense. There's actually versions of Dungeons and Dragons, but forking would make sense in that context. So a lot of the patterns that we have around our work are things that, if we formalize and make sense of them, we can do what I think is the most common advice. And that's when I ask what kind of advice you've heard when you into it. A lot of the answers I would expect are along the lines of, think of your work as an increasingly sophisticated work. That is, this peer programming someone, ask someone how to do, what is the pattern to do things, is because of this very long list of tasks that are evolutionarily better. Typically, if you are a data engineer, you want to think about events that you can aggregate into totals, and then you can draw curves, and then you can say, here's what's happening. And then if like someone did something yesterday, you can see, oh, look, here's where the curve would be. So you can infer the impacts, and like what's the relationship between you as a promotion and how much sales you get. That is a great gradient in evolution. And you have here a list of evolution. Observation, trend, hypothesis, theory. That is like typically what you would expect to have around a product analyst or someone who runs A/B test. Table, database, metrics, goal tree, strategy. That is the kind of evolution you expect from someone who is trying to define goals for an organization. All those lines have the job that is kind of attached to it. You want to have someone who's increasingly talented at writing code, and if you can have scripts, you can fit in a notebook. You can have a code base that defines a separate library. You can have just a self-hosted service. If you want to use information to convince people, you have an anecdote that can turn into a story that you can influence people with. That's gradient. Those, you don't want just to use a couple of the numbers. You want to have a whole thing about it. It's a very common pattern you would see. And I think that is a very valuable thing. But that evolution implies that automations and machine are going to take the first steps and know how to go from the first to the second to the third step. But the fourth and fifth step are still going to be left over, because this is harder. You want some experience. And until now, all the tools or the patterns make more sense early on. There is a systematic way to turn a notebook into a code base and turn a code base into a library. This is something you can reasonably expect a large language model to make properly. But hosting that as a service, you have frameworks and tools you can do it. We still expect to have some sort of humans. Same thing if you want to have some sort of influence. You can automate drafting a presentation, but making that conversation compelling, making sure that conversation is going to address someone's concern, that still feels like something that a human would do. And I'm not sure that hierarchy is still true. I don't think we're necessarily going to be pushed by the bottom into more interesting, more thoughtful, more experienced, more senior tasks. because LLM have proven reasonably effective at doing something. So far, we've lost jobs through specialization because those patterns allowed us to go up. So far, we've lost jobs to automation, especially through external tools, because people realize, oh, I've used this and this at Google, so now I can just sell it as a function of this at Amazon and something that other people want to buy. And so one of the rare instances of job that has been lost because they were not super high value jobs and they were merged into someone else's. So making a funnel, not super exciting, but now it's something that you can do with a tool, and it's something that like a product manager is able to just click and get with a no-code system, get a version. And now they do the last version of a funnel, which is make decision on where does the step 2 be fixed. That means that in that case, we did lose a job. It's a job nobody really wanted because like it's not super exciting. Making funnels is not super exciting task. But that transformation assumes things about the data work that are not super true. The actual data work is less at the top and more between the cracks. All the abstractions that I talked about, all this list, are just have leaky concepts. One key thing is what people actually do when they're fighting, like if someone is spending time on something, it's probably they have a model, but they're trying to turn it into like a system that they can build. So the Docker is not really working because you have dependency conflict. They just don't have the right permission because they don't know what to store the secrets properly, or they have to replace secrets and like it just doesn't work. Or the machine has like not enough memory and crashes. That is something that is still something we have to do. Something that will probably be the work that is left for humans, because a lot of those I feel like something that LLMs are not necessarily good at doing, but it's not the highest level task. That it's not architecture. An LLM is really good at architecture and will get better. I'm not sure a lot of data scientists are that good at building a good machine learning architecture. Another common problems that we deal with is statistical issues. Like you have values that are nulls because there's some sort of issue. You have the data skewed because it's unbalanced. You have a model shift and to be able to detect. You have outliers out of bounds. Those problems, I feel like, even if they feel unusual and weird, because your solutions are more standardized, they can be taken over by automated systems. So I would be surprised if there were not solutions that make sense that went better into common tools, open source tools or private tools. And the one aspect where I see the most humane parts of the problem, but I don't know if large language models are going to take over, is the Gore misalignment problem. Is it what we're doing? Does it make sense to what the rest of what we're trying to do? We are building a model because we think that better recommendations or recommendations that have more in those interactions are going to increase conversion rate. Have we validated this assumption? How do we validate this assumption? A very common presentation that does that reasonably well is a presentation by Vincent Waterman, who's very active at PyData Amsterdam and Eindhoven. Recently, like 2 weeks ago, he did a talk at PyData Eindhoven where he talked about disappearing gorilla. It sounds weird, but like he had a gorilla in a data set and asked 2 groups of people to answer questions, humans. One of them was given us not a general task, and the other one were like specific questions to answer. Those with certification missed the gorilla. That's a machine would not be able to test the gorilla because they wouldn't be realized that there's something weird there. But we miss something because we have more structure. Is I think instrumental into thinking what is our job, what are the parts that we can take over, and Vincent's example are quite common because he made many presentations around this topic, around artificial stupidity or like other concepts around false labeling. And this application of patterns is hiding the danger, the leaky abstractions behind those. And so I'm not necessarily confident that having a machine that applies pattern blindly is going to be a better version of a more systematic or cheaper version of a data scientist. But that's because there's not just patterns of how to do things, there's also very common patterns of mistake. Vincent described some of them quite artistically, but there's stories that didn't make sense until I actually had a job and realized these were common, like the lamppost fallacy, where people say, oh, stories, someone lost the key, lose behind a lamppost, and like, you lose your key here. Like, no, but that's where the light is. I thought this was completely ridiculous. This story doesn't make sense until I actually work with data, and people do that all the time. They do this. We want to optimize for a certain metric. It's like, but that's not a metric you, like that would actually be impacted by your change. You're like, yeah, but that's the metric I have. Same thing for the dots on a plane for selection bias fallacy. Those, and more generally more psychological effects, are well documented, and LLMs are familiar with those. So even if more systematic patterns free humans to have more insightful, more irreverent take, if you want to take Vincent Vanderman's approach to data science, they are not, this is not something that an LLM would not be able to do. One example that is related to that is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, have talked about how LLMs are going to be more convincing than humans. And they're really good at providing adaptation to a certain issue. So if you say, you might not be optimizing for the right model, a human might shrug and be like, yeah, but that's the data we have. A machine would be able to say, oh, so we need to collect data. Here's how we can convince someone to have the budget for that data. They're not really good at it now, but I definitely expect LLMs to evolve beyond life patterns that they've definitely learned. You can see that the way they do object-oriented programming, the way they're able to, if you ask them how do you do funnel analysis, they'll be able to be really good at it. So they're very familiar with the patterns, but they're also familiar with how leaky they are. So they can, if you give a data template, answer open-ended business questions. So if you say, here's what my data frame look like, can you tell me which data has the most sales? Or can you tell me, where we should invest our marketing budget to get more increase? They would be able to run the SQL code and like get that inference. But they also, that's not just given the data template, is if you give them the description of the company with reasonable data shape, they're able to turn that into a reusable data model. So they're going after the data engineering work. Same thing for templating. They train on code that was refactored, on code that was revised, on code review, on how to configure a service. So if you say, I have a service that I want to do this and that, how would you write a proc file to be able to host it on this service? They would be able to do that reasonably well and give you really good advice around it. So they have beyond unusual ability to understand framework. But if you want to go beyond that, they are increasingly able to make sense. If you're able to share the right context with them, they're able to report on activity and understand outlying elements. So it's not just standard analysis. It's, here's something that you want to look into. They can make suggestions based on those outliers around what the assumption could be. And so they can go at the highest level of what I would consider analyst job to be. They can draft action plan and they can measure whether that thing. So this ability to suggest ideas, check that they're okay, and if those ideas are okay, challenge yourself to revert, which is something that humans are not that good at. I think those models are actually reasonably good at doing it. The last thing I want to warn people against that revolution is a lot of people say, oh, building those LLM models is really cool, that's what I want to do. I don't think a lot of people are going to train them because training is so expensive. A lot of people are, the very large system, the thing that is exciting is not really good. A lot of what people are to do is the plumbing around it, either building adaptations, building retraining, refining models. A lot of the work around refining is doing the other work, just as there was one yellow square and all the things around. LLMs are going to have the same forest of what is the right kind of metric, what is the kind of reporting, what is the right kind of issues around it that are essentially the traditional data work. But someone who understands that can be powered by LLM tools to build that extension around, and I don't know what work is left. And that's what led me to worry, panic, and go back to core historical ideas around what are data, why do people pay us to do what we're doing? What is the value into what we're doing? One core idea is the idea of complementarity. It's a very common thing in economics. If you sell two things together, so waffles and ice cream, for instance, on screen, if one of them then becomes cheaper, then the other ones become has more demand. It doesn't have to be more expensive, but it has more demand, so you can sell more of it. So if you have like some sort of policy around dairy farm and milk, and you have suddenly too much milk, and then you say, oh, you're going to turn all that milk into ice cream becomes cheaper. That means you're going to sell more waffles. That seems a little bit stupid example, but it has happened. The book called Prediction Machine has a really good take on it around, because we have cheaper data storage, because we have cheaper compute storage, the role of analyzing that and gathering the data, analyzing it, has become a lot more valuable. It's economists who look at companies and how they're organized, and they have identified 6 things that are really key to making a decision, like gathering data, understanding it. And because of some of those become cheaper, so that's the gathering the data and analyzing it, the things that are complement become cheaper too. And that's analyst and the one thing that is really interesting in the model is because they think of data as something that is an input into making a decision, the other inputs, the other complement to that, so those become cheaper. Therefore, the key thing is what they called a judgment, what you can think of as alignment, which is, what do you think is good? Because it's cheap to run an A/B test. Now what became valuable is defining the right metric for an A/B test. The second thing I say, which I think is really interesting, and seem counterintuitive unless you actually go through a model and understand what they're talking about, is because making decision is key, is becoming more valuable. The ability to make decision is key. And therefore, one thing they mention is, if you take a lot of actions, this is going to benefit you. If you're already a large player, because you have a lot of activity that you are privy to, if you sell stuff, you know who bought it, so you know what more they want. Large company get this very significant data gravity phenomena. And that intuition of big data tools benefit big companies was never spelled out as clearly as in that model. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do. But this is still very classic economics. One aspect of it that is interesting, that is not very surprising, and that's what I've been talking about with those patterns, is an intuition coming from Fred White, an engineer around aeronautics, who realized that the first time you make an airplane, it's very difficult, and then it gets gradually easier. And so for every, what they call doubling of production, so the more airplanes you make, the easier, faster, cheaper it is to make an airplane. And that is why we talk about craft, why we talk about patterns, why we talk about, because the more machine learning training you've had, the more you know what you're talking about. And that is also very classic. So far, what I've talked about is very classic economics, but there's a more interesting take. This gentleman, Ron Coase, a century ago asked, why do we have companies? Because all the models talk about individual agents. And he was like, why is the organization? Why are there hierarchies? And I think the role of data emerges from what he's trying to say here. His key idea is, economics talk about goods that you buy and sell, but there's another cost that people overlook, which is a transaction cost. Every time you make a decision, you have to clarify what decision is, make sure you take the right decision. And that has a cost. And a lot of the decision, a lot of the structure we see is coming from efforts to minimize that cost. The company is what they call a nexus of transactions. So you have a lot of transactions happening, but those transactions have been pulled together to be more effective and more efficient. And because they've been pulled together, they have a form of rigidity. He talks about butter in buttermilk. Unless you've actually done that yourself, it might not be a meaningful example, but there's harder places. Things are still quite soft, but there's harder places in some places. And those harder places mean you have reasonably entrenched institution, like a hierarchy, your boss. And people might overlook those, but the reason they're there is because they make things cheaper. Having a hierarchy or long-term contracts really allow you to spend less time finding the right kind of talent that you would have if you have a contractor, or training workers, because you know they're going to be overweight. It lowers the risk of both you finding a job and a company finding the right kind of workers. And it allows people to coordinate on what you're supposed to do, because you don't have to say for every contract, here's your task for the next days. You say, I'm going to pay you per month, and you're going to do what you want within those hours. And we're going to decide what it is as we iterate, as we grow, but here's a general vision. Having that allows to have cheaper, more overall connection. And that's having that, one of the key things that he informs, and something that you want to think of as a data scientist. And I think that informs the key thing is those tools, build versus build, are key, because they allow you to think of, is what I'm trying to do something that is common, that is not very difficult to judge and negotiate. Something that is like, if you have it, you know you have it. Always something that has a high transaction cost. That is, you have to evaluate, you have to personalize, you have to think about it. If it's the first kind, then it's definitely something you want to buy. And if the tool you're building is something that everybody agrees works in the same way, doesn't need personalization, then you shouldn't build it internally. You should buy it from a vendor. That's the trend that comes naturally from the COES model of a transaction cost. If something is uncertain, that's something you want to build. If something is trained on very large data sets beyond what your own organization has ability, then this is something you want to build, which is why people are not entirely sure whether or not Google, OpenAI have a clear monopoly. They're the only company who can spend that much money on getting the data and training it. I'd be very surprised if there were many large companies who do that kind of effort. A handful of companies are going to, some of them are going to share them as open source, TBD, but that I think is going to stay concentrated. And if what you have is actually trained or differentiated on what you have, it's not just where people want to go on holiday, is where your clients want to go on holiday, then this is something you want to build internally. That first distinction, I think, comes out naturally from the model. But I think where this model is a lot more interesting for us is it highlights how making decision is expensive, difficult, and hard. It's very risky. You might have some, you want to keep some deniability in case your position in the company is challenged because you took that decision. You want to have some psychological safety to make sure people are comfortable with this, making those risk factors are really essential. And you want to coordinate people that have very different approach. If you're in a website and you're trying to get people through a website as fast as possible, you want to remove all the warnings about, oh, by the way, this is a very small t-shirt, so maybe you don't want it. But the customer service team, they definitely want you to have those warnings because they don't want to have people calling back and like canceling orders because the t-shirt is too small. That lack of alignment requires, it's a genuine conflict that is very difficult. Or more systematically, you have multiple things you could do. You could do better marketing, you could do outreach, you could do PR, you could have better products, you could rebrand. You don't know where to allocate your budget. And having coordination, deciding what to do is incredibly difficult. But a data role is a role that allows you to optimize those decisions, allows you to focus on anomalies. So if you have a lot of things to do, but generally things go well, you can grow your team because a system can tell you this is the person that is selling less than usual. So that's the person who you want to see if they're selling well. The other ones have like normal average a number of sales, so you don't want to worry about them. It allows you to have a typology of problem. You have many people complaining to you. As a manager, you don't know what to tell your team, what's up. But if you're able to take all those feedbacks and classify them, then you can say, okay, if these are what the clients tell you, here's the response. And here are the things where I want to, if you don't fall into that substation, you want to talk about myself. So a lot of the data, whether reporting or inference, allow you to align all the concerns and let people understand we're not investing into a rebranding, but the rebranding would be expensive and not have a very clear impact. While if we do ads, we know what the impact would be. And thanks to the work of the data team, we can measure that risk and we can have people agree that less risk is better. That's, I think, and that's a personal opinion, that is definitely something I would want to discuss with how you understand close theory and how you understand your role, whether this is the best way to look at the role we're trying to do. One aspect of that I haven't talked about, and this is PyData Global, so this is something we want to highlight, is I talked about organization. COES talks about firms, as in for-profit company, because that's the example he had in mind. But there's been some addendum around it, around what is open source? How does open source work? The key person there is Elena Ostrom, who took over and like expanded the work. She's not technically an economist, but she was able to highlight how organization can also emerge, not if there's a profit, but if there's a shared resource. So she looked at Peasant Collective, like people especially around water rights. And that I think is a really good model for how we think about open source. The first thing why people contribute is signaling, which is just lowering the cost of you being hired. So that is very standard economic model. The ideas that Elena Ostrom would like. Organizations are the cheapest way for groups of people without clear ties, without like obvious enforcement mechanism, to get people to incentivize in the right way, is I think really good because she takes the same idea and applies it in a context that doesn't have necessarily a strict hierarchy. One word about, because I'm talking about LLMs and I'm talking now about open source. Open source LLM are not technically open source because it's not the same thing. They're refinable, but they're not reproducible entirely. That distinction, I think, is really key. I won't have time to get into detail now. What is being shared is a side product of research. And so it's just a file that they make available without making available the rest of the work, or not as much. And because they think that sharing has better externalities, less negative externalities than the rest. So if they share it, people will want to join their company, but they're not helping any one of their competitors. So it's not necessarily the same mindset as open source as a common, something that we want to all work together. Even if there's the same intuition, I think there's a meaningful difference. And it's about a single organization signaling, not maintaining that common. I'll break because I've got a couple of questions. Let me just share with you. In the data field, in 3 to 5 years, what's your take? Is it better to opt for part-time freelance gigs for diverse experience, even if less stable pay? I'm going to answer that quite controversially towards the end, but it depends on your own experience. If you can get good high-level gigs, if you feel like what you're doing is interesting and cutting edge, and you're working in tools that are new, I think it makes sense because it will give you more diversity, but mostly because I'm very worried about where organizations are going to be in 3 to 5 years. I expect a lot of replacement. In 2001, like I remember having every corner of every street a travel agency. Those were gone because internet was able to replace them more effectively. It's not just travel agency. There's a lot of types of work that have high street supermarket that were replaced by Amazon. I expect a similar kind of revolution to happen, and I don't know what are the big companies that I don't think that's as stable as they claim to be, even though there are some big companies that have digitalized properly and that are now bigger than they were before. So if you don't have that kind of experience, if all the patterns that talk about something that you're not familiar with, you want to get those, and I don't think people will invest in your expertise as a freelancer as much. And I don't think you're going to get really good grade that is. You could, because there's a lot of open source resources. So it really depends. If you're not senior, I think working in a stable institution will give you a lot of space to learn those things, and like things that you wouldn't learn outside of that context. If you are senior, I think it makes sense to explore and like get a better feel of what's happening. I personally changed a lot of organization for when there was some crisis, not necessarily by just because the personnel had to move, and that showed me things I didn't expect to see otherwise. Second part of the question: would you recommend for stability? I'm worried that this stability is something that is going to be disruptive, and one of the key thing here that I want to address is let me see, how can I why is there diversity between organizations? And I think is a key thing when you see, you have better ways of doing things. You can use version control. Not everybody does it. You can use digitization. Like yesterday, I was supposed to sign a physical paper, and the fact that I was in the same room as someone else was a problem. I haven't seen a sheet of paper in a decade. There's a very uneven distribution of how those new patterns evolve, both very basic things like signing papers or very high level things. Like not every company uses the DBT. Not every company uses a top of the art machine learning operations model, even if they would benefit from it. And that's because of innovators' dilemma. Until that thing is proven to be very effective, trying is very risky, and people don't really know when it goes from it's not risky anymore, it's obligatory, but also because coordination is incredibly hard. As long as nobody's losing their job, they're not taking that much risk and they're not trying the new thing. And if the system is working, they have no reason to be challenged internally. And that's where I think travel agency were not able to get on the internet because of them were too small, and they could not beat Booking.com or Skyscanner because they didn't see those as competitors until they were. The last thing is a lot of people see the way they're doing things as obvious, the way water doesn't make sense of fish because they're surrounded by it. And it's very hard to get people to say the way you do things is counterproductive. I've been trying to write something somewhere and like that. Someone just keeps sending me a version of that document as an attached file to an email. And then I say, you should work with Google Docs or anything that is version controlled. They look at me like it was funny. That suggestion, that was I'm not trying to use Google Docs, I'm trying to use version control. The fact that those two things were separate, that concept, the pattern wasn't something that was obvious for them. And that explains why there's a company that feel like they're 25 years ago. There's why a company that's the example I use usually is people using Teams, even if everybody seems to hate it because that's kind of set established, but people don't know that you could do better. the person that, if you want, what is happening with this LLM and how people work, the key intuition is Eric Johnson, who's the director of the economics lab at Stanford. His key insight is that we're seeing a lot of automation, but those automation is not at the role level, it's per task. And that's why I went through like the different 10 different roles. I wanted to go at the task level that just didn't fit in like an hour format. He sees some tasks being replaced and not some not being replaced. And that is really good at understanding what's going to happen. That's how he was able to say that some jobs are not going to be replaced, not because the jobs are particularly hard, but because none of the tasks of those jobs, what people actually spend time doing, is just not going to be replaced. Nurse is a really good example of a task, but like it's a lot harder to explain and softer than what it makes sense. While someone who does expense review most likely might be replaced. That focus on don't look at the role root task really helps understand what makes sense, and which is why I talked about patterns, which is why I talked about structure and habits. That is where it makes sense. He doesn't think that this idea of LLM is a more sophisticated tool makes sense because they can replace high-level tasks, and so that's one thing where I definitely would have to agree with him on. LLMs can do high-level tasks that other people cannot do. And finally, the one thing that's the one intuition from his research that makes a lot of sense is he separates people that use LLMs as a hybrid, either the LLM does it or a human does it, or CentOS. They're both using a human is using the tool at the same time. And he sees that the impact on the organization is very different. The one thing that he's quite adamant, and someone who's doing innovation a lot, is he sees innovators' dilemma in full force. It took an incredibly long time to get transformation from the internet. The organization are just using the process. That was known as Solo's paradox. In around 2000, people, computers are everywhere, so computers are going to increase productivity. And like Solo was like, I'm not seeing it in numbers. And that was because people were using computers as a proxy for paper. They were sending emails when they would have sent internal memos until they realized, oh, no, we shouldn't have a process that is essentially paper-based. We should have a process using a very completely different internal tooling and that took people decades to understand how it makes sense. That slowed people considerably. And I think people, because they see OLMs are a big thing, but they haven't changed my job in a year, therefore I'm fine. I'm missing the fact that the blow is going to come harder later and in an unexpected way. A bit like a tech-savvy wolf, he's already above the cliff, doesn't know yet, and he's going to fall and hurt himself. What is more likely to happen, and I think that's the answer to the question that I've seen, is the company, if I could join something, I would join a company that isn't created yet or isn't big yet, but that will leverage LLMs in a way, in a business model that without it wouldn't make sense. An example of where I think like would be fantastic is a company that takes all customer feedback, aggregates them into here's a feature that the company needs to build, here's something you need to change, and turns that into code that behind a feature flag, and A/B test that to see his customer said this, they would like this. And if you actually look at what's happening, this was something that made, this is something that actually impacted that satisfaction, or customers said they like it, we could do it, but then we lose money if we did it. How do you think about your own career in that context? I think it's going to change things, but I don't think it's going to change the bulk of the advice I would give in that context. Find something that gets you excited. Find like life is too precious to waste it on stuff that you don't get excited over. So please find a job works where you want to be motivated, something that you want to make happen. And your contribution there is what makes sense. Learn the craft. Being good at something, spending time in, like the people who give talks about PyData, except me, know what they're talking about. That comes from spending time doing it. It's a myth behind 10,000 hours. And that will allow you to signal people, I'm good at this. And you can do that with open source, because that's I think a really valuable, visible step to do, but just working inside companies. If you are not super experienced, I would say go to large jobs because they can teach you more. But they're not that innovative. They are stuck in this process. They do things well, but they don't do the latest thing well because they're already doing things well. Data engineering at Meta is not that exceptional because they had really good one 10 years ago and it hasn't evolved as much as it could. And therefore, because if you want to be at the latest tool with a little bit of experience, I would say try open source, try your own idea, work in a company that will give you a bit more freedom. That makes a lot more sense. How to navigate your existing options. If you manage to get into a tool that you know everybody's going to use, share tool, set that everybody makes sense, you will have a large impact, but it's a much smaller job market. And so I don't know how many A/B testing company the world needs, but it's not 50. But there is job in taking that tool and personalizing it. So being a consultant that helps company who has an A/B test tool and doesn't know what to do, I think there's a lot more position there, and it's a lot more accessible in that sense. But it's a lot harder to personalize that service automatically, at least until a year ago. Open source is fantastic, but it is only a project where the maintenance is something that individuals can do because because they're motivated. It can rapidly hit limits of not having that much investment in them. NumFOCUS is trying to do tremendous work there, but it's still limited compared to private investment. And where coordination can become rapidly expensive because you don't have the same organizational structure that you would have. Looking at open source projects versus companies with the lens of COSO and OSCOM really shows you there is an intrinsic issue there that limits what can be done with open source. That has been proven wrong because the ambition and the quality of a lot of the projects. PyData is a fantastic example of that. But you want to understand the limits of maintainers face every day. Key insights that nobody will deny. Being a junior now is incredibly hard because remote now I have just taken over the opportunity to learn by pair programming, by doing review. Shadowing is incredibly hard. Kaggle used to be a really good way to train, to signal that you're really good at feature engineering and scaling. These are not challenges as much as they used to be. And data that was really able to scrape, API that were available, all that is gone because people now see the value they have to train an LLM. So now that is just intrinsically hard. I don't have a good answer for that. And finally, transaction cost will mean that ideas and experimenting on ideas might get cheaper. Communication will be a lot more effective. You can just not listen to a meeting and like have a summary that is auto-generated. But I don't know if that means conversations are going to get bigger or smaller. And that's, I think, the misunderstanding from Co's model is if people think, oh, if communication cost is less, then companies are going to get bigger. Both internal and external communication costs. So the distinction between the butter and the buttermilk is just going to move, but it's not going to mean you have bigger cluster of butter or smaller. And overall, the adoption is going to be incredibly uneven. It took 20 years to see computers in production numbers. And that's when Google was basically the majority of the economy. And the key thing, if you want to understand what's happening, is look at what you're doing, break it down into individual tasks and be like, could that be automated? Which is a very tedious work and something that I've had to do. I don't know if I've shared my fears as effectively as I would like. I don't know if I've answered any of your concerns. I was hoping to give a framework around a question that I've heard a lot, much more recently than in the last 20 years, but it's not a new question. It's just more pressing now. And I've tried to answer the question I got, but if you have more questions, I'll be available on Slack here for a couple of minutes. And otherwise, very easy to find online on LinkedIn or elsewhere at Bertil Hatt.